Good afternoon. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to see so many of you here. I would like to welcome you to another talk in the context of our lecture series, The United States in World Affairs, the Cold War and Beyond. I'm afraid this is the last talk for this semester. However, there's something to look forward to. In the fall, we will be back with another exciting lecture series. I'm Klaus Laris, and I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. I would like to thank our many generous sponsors for supporting this exciting lecture series. And as always, if you would like to become a sponsor yourself, please let me know, and I certainly won't turn you down. All our talks and lectures, as you know, are available on our YouTube channel. Please watch our talks. They're all highly exciting. Watch them as often as possible, and please subscribe to our channel, and then you will immediately be informed if something new has been uploaded. Our talk today does not look at a precise foreign policy crisis during the Cold War years. Instead, the talk today takes a long view and considers American foreign policy in perspective. What were and what are the principles and major structures and elements which have shaped US foreign relations in the 19th and 20th century? What are the major challenges American foreign policy faces today? Relations with China come to mind, perhaps, and of course the complex and difficult relationship with Russia, which is very much on Washington's foreign policy agenda today. We are all very fortunate that one of the foremost experts on America's foreign relations has joined us today to explain it all to us. I'm very pleased to welcome Professor George Herring of the University of Kentucky to Chapel Hill today. Thank you very much for coming. Professor Herring is a specialist in US foreign relations and not least on the history of the Vietnam War. Indeed, George was kind enough as to come to my Cold War class this afternoon to enlighten our undergraduates about the Vietnam War. And after that, George Harris was so kind as to talk to us in our new series, 5-Minute Insights, and he gave a very precise synopsis of what the Vietnam War was all about, and that again will be up on our YouTube channel within the next few days, I hope. George Herring's most recent work is a massive textbook, which my students know or ought to know very well, From Colony to Superpower, American Foreign Relations since 1776. And this book is part of the prestigious Oxford History of the United States. George Herring's other published works include, for example, the diaries of former Secretary of State Edward Stettinius, and then America's Longest War, the United States and Vietnam, 1950 to 1975. And now it's already in its 5th edition. There's also the book, The Secret Diplomacy of the Vietnam War, the negotiating volumes of the Pentagon Papers, and LBJ and Vietnam, a different kind of war. A few years ago, Professor Herring retired after a mere 36 years at the University of Kentucky, including 11 as chair of the Department of History. George is now Alumni Professor of History Emeritus at the University of Kentucky. During his long and successful career, he also was visiting professor at the US Military Academy in West Point and the University of Richmond, and he also was a Fulbright Scholar in New Zealand. In 2005, he also was acting director of the Patterson School of Diplomacy. George Herring has won many prizes, too numerous to list here. And in 1989-1990, he also was president of SHAFER, the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations. I'm told that when Professor Herring isn't writing and giving talks, which is a seldom occurrence, he likes to play with his 6 grandchildren. Today, George Herring's talk is entitled Looking Back, Thinking Ahead, US Foreign Policy in Perspective. I would like to encourage all of you, including our students here, to ask plenty of questions after the talk today. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the great pleasure and honor to present to you today Professor George Herring.
Thanks, Klaus, for that nice introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be here on this beautiful campus where spring still reigns today. I left home to snow this morning, and may well go back to worse. I don't know. I'm going to speak very broadly this afternoon, and a lot of it will draw from what Klaus described as my massive book. You know, I really feel good to see that there's a book here that's larger than mine, and I lifted it and got away with it. And also I draw heavily on my colleague and friend of many years, Michael Hunt, in his wonderful book, Ideology and Foreign Policy. I take my text not from the masters of diplomacy, the Metternichs, the Bismarcks, but rather from British mystery writer P.D. James. You can see what retired folk get to do. You can't write it out, can you? One of James's characters observes, speaking of history. It's over, but it's still with us. It's the same whether it's a person or a country. It happened. It made us what we are. We have to understand it. Let me begin with a flashback to 1796. The infant United States was bitterly divided internally. Imagine that. And in dire threat from abroad. Its president, George Washington, was embattled and increasingly unpopular. Borrowing from the Old Testament book of Micah, a beleaguered Washington yearned for a time when his nation would have the strength of a giant, and there will be none who can make us afraid. Fast forward more than 200 years to the dawn of the 21st century. The United States had achieved a position of world power Washington could not have imagined in his wildest dreams. Pundits hailed a unipolar moment. Comparisons were widely drawn with ancient Rome and Victorian England, the only examples that seemed adequately to compare to America's global preeminence in the year 2000. This nation's rise from a group of small, disparate colonies huddled along the Atlantic coast of North America to a commanding position in world politics and economics is, I think, an epic story, the story I try to tell in the Oxford book. It's a tale of restless settlers pushing out against weak restraints, of explorers, merchants, adventurers carrying American ways to new lands. It includes filmmakers and other agents of the nation's soft power, even a Voice of America disc jockey by the name of Willis Conover, who waged the Cold War with jazz and was said to have been more powerful than a fleet of B-29 bombers. There are countless crises, some bordering on comic opera. An 1893 near war with Chile, for example, provoked by a bar fight between Chileans and American sailors. The American sailors properly drunk, their captain insisted. Other crises absolutely harrowing, obviously, the much written about 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. The more we learn about it, the more harrowing it appears. Also, a lesser-known 1983 incident in which nuclear war may, I emphasize the word may, have been averted by the timely and courageous intervention of a Red Army colonel. And what a grand cast of characters, bad actors aplenty, the first ugly Americans, for example. Joel Poinsett, better known for giving his name to a bright red Christmas flower, and Anthony Butler, both of whom, as ministers to Mexico in the 1820s, treated their host country with contempt and shamelessly meddled in its internal affairs. Rather typical of the sort of diplomats we dispatched to Latin America in the 19th century. Probably the sorriest of the lot, I regret to say, was a Kentuckian, the notorious Edward Rumsey Wing, who as minister to Ecuador in the 1860s first tried to annex that country to the United States, then to assassinate the British ambassador. Luckily, he was a bad shot. Luckily, also, he was incapacitated by the DTs before he could do further damage to the interest and reputation of the United States. On the positive side, there are diplomats of extraordinary skill, beginning, of course, with Benjamin Franklin, one of our first envoys, maybe one of our best. A master propagandist whose countenance in Paris in 1777 appeared on snuff boxes, rings, medals, bracelets, even, it was said, on an envious King Louis's chamber pot. And it was, of course, Franklin who persuaded a wary court, a French court, to support the Americans with money, arms, and troops, crucial to the outcome of the Revolution. Among many others, I would single out the lesser-known Townsend Harris, a truly remarkable person who, with no guidance from Washington, with persistence and remarkable cultural sensitivity, negotiated an important trade agreement with Japan in the 1860s. People from other nations obviously play key roles. The French officials who make the decisions to support the United States during the Revolution. Santa Anna, 11 times president of Mexico, who wept openly when shown a map of the vast territory lost to the United States in the Mexican-American War. One of my favorites in more recent times is the ebullient and sometimes reckless Nikita Khrushchev, Soviet premier during the heyday of the Cold War. Khrushchev once likened diplomacy to playing chess in the dark, and when you keep in mind that occasionally the game pieces were nuclear weapons, it gets quite scary. He was mortified, little story, upon arriving at the Geneva summit in 1955 to discover that his plane was much, much smaller than the plane flown by Dwight Eisenhower. Like an insect, he snarled. So when he visited the United States in 1959, his specially built Tupolev 114 was so large there was no portable stairwell high enough for people could exit in the normal way. So the Soviet leader and his entourage had to debark in a most undignified manner by sliding down an emergency exit at the rear of the plane. Okay, I've got the fun out of the way now. We have to get serious. A couple of themes that I'd like to sketch out during the rest of the time that I hope will offer some perspective on our understanding and dealing with today's complex and ever-changing world. First, from the start, foreign policy has been central to the national experience. The Declaration of Independence, to start right there. Many goals, but its essential aim was to persuade possibly friendly European powers, Britain's enemies obviously, that the Americans were serious about their revolution. Of course, aid from France and other European nations was indispensable to U.S. independence. No battle was more important in the American Civil War than the contest waged in the diplomatic arena, Alan Nevins wrote many years ago. Lincoln and Seward's combination of bluster and conciliation helped avert European intervention and ensure the Union's survival, and, as historians are increasingly emphasize, not only the Union's survival, but also America's emergence as a true world power at the end of the Civil War. And of course, during this nation's second century and beyond, foreign policy became ever more critical to its prosperity and security. The enduring idea of an isolationist America, still found in some textbooks, is, I think, a myth sometimes used to safeguard the nation's self-image of its innocence. The word isolationism, in fact, did not come into political parlance until around World War I. It accurately describes U.S. policy only in the 1930s. In fact, from 1776 on, the United States was an active and influential player in world affairs. Foreign policy has had a significant and enduring impact on American life. We might at times wish the world would go away, maybe especially now in this age of reluctance, but it never has and it never will, and for the most part, to be honest, we haven't wanted to. Now, we did pursue during much of our history a unilateralist approach to world affairs. Such a course seemed eminently sensible in the 18th and 19th century. Americans rightly fearing that entanglement in Europe's wars and contamination from Europe's politics might destroy the Republican experiment. Unilateralism also had a basis in geography. The United States was blessed among nations, a French diplomat commented around the turn of the 20th century, maybe with a touch of envy. To the north and south, there were weak neighbors. On the east, fish, and on the west, fish. And indeed, throughout much of its history, geography gave the United States an advantage enjoyed by few nations, the absence of major foreign threats, permitting it to avoid binding foreign commitments and potentially ruinous foreign wars, to expand and prosper with minimal distraction from abroad. Free security, historian C. Van Woodward called it years ago. In the 1890s, some Americans began to argue that a world reduced in size, made more dangerous by technology, rendered traditional unilateralism outdated, but it would take the Second World War, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the advent of jet aircraft and nuclear weapons to shatter long-standing assumptions that the United States was safe from foreign threat. During the Cold War era, suddenly embattled Americans turned traditional European unilateralism on its head. The absence of major threats throughout much of our history made us, I think, hypersensitive to threats when they did occur, leading to often exaggerated perceptions of dangers everywhere. The Cold War came to be seen as a zero-sum game, in which gains for communism anywhere across the globe seemed to represent losses for the so-called free world. Through a global network of alliances, the United States took on obligations to defend more than 40 nations, a level of commitment, Paul Kennedy has observed, that would have made such hardcore imperialists as Louis XIV or Lloyd Palmerston a little nervous. Such was the potency of the unilateral tradition, however, that even after a half-century of multilateralism and global commitment, it resurfaced in the George W. Bush administration in the radically altered environment of the post-Cold War era. And even when we have been engaged with other nations, I would add, we have much preferred to operate on our own terms, another manifestation, I think, of a unilateral state of mind. From 1776, and even when there was little cause to do so, Americans have been certain of their nation's peculiar destiny. Washington spoke of a rising empire, Jefferson, an empire for liberty. In the 1840s, Americans believed it their manifest destiny to spread across the continent and even beyond. Amidst the unparalleled carnage of World War I, Woodrow Wilson set out to realize the founders' dreams by proclaiming that a broken world must be repaired by Americans operating on the basis of American principles. Such was the nation's power and influence after World War II that the 20th century came to be called the American century. And at the end of that century, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright would talk of the United States as the indispensable nation. George W. Bush would claim that he and his nation had been called to extend God's gift of liberty to every human being in the world. Americans have also seen themselves as distinctively different, a people apart. American exceptionalism, it is called. The revolutionary generation rebelled not simply against Great Britain, but also against old world ways. European history formed a summary of the evils which America has escaped, a Kentucky lawyer commented in the early 19th century. Thomas Jefferson condemned traditional great power diplomacy as the pest of the peace of the world. Americans saw themselves as heralds of a new world order, in which enlightened diplomacy, buttressed by free trade, would create a new international system that would serve the broader needs of humankind rather than the selfish interest of kings and their courts. And in the early national period, Americans absolutely flaunted their distinctiveness. The new nation refused to appoint anybody to the rank of ambassador, in part to save money, which it desperately needed to do, but also because it was more in keeping with Republican ideals. As president, Jefferson scandalized the diplomatic community and almost caused a crisis in Anglo-American relations by receiving a British diplomat, a rather haughty chap, while clad in carpet slippers and a shabby housecoat, and by instituting at state dinners a system of pell-mell seating without any regard for rank. You'd love to have been a fly on the wall when those things were taking place. In the mid-19th century, diplomats representing the now proudly democratic United States ostentatiously wore simple black attire instead of the standard diplomatic uniform. The French, of course, sneered at the Black Crow, but Americans cheered. The person who represented his nation should look like an American, talk like an American, and be an American example, a New York newspaper proclaimed. As the United States emerged to world power status, it made its peace with conventional diplomatic practice. First ambassadors appointed in the 1890s, reasons largely pragmatic. U.S. ministers were outranked in European courts, had difficulty transacting business, but Americans have continued to see themselves as distinct to the present some quarters, diplomacy and diplomats are viewed as inherently elitist and undemocratic, even effete. From Massachusetts Bay Colony founder John Winthrop's call for a city on a hill through Jefferson and Wilson to George W. Bush's born-again zeal, Americans have seen themselves as a chosen people with a providential mission. God's American Israel, the Puritans called it. They have prided themselves on what they believe to be their unique innocence and virtue, the most moral and generous people on earth, in Ronald Reagan's words. They have claimed for themselves a special obligation to extend to others the blessings of freedom, sometimes disagreed on the means to be used. In 1821, for example, political rivals Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams reached rare heights of eloquence in debating whether the United States should actively support revolutions then taking place in Latin America and Greece. A quick aside, this is really a dynamic duo. A 19th century odd couple at Ghent in 1814, the fun-loving Clay was usually stumbling to bed after a night of drinking and cards, just about the time that Adams was rising for morning prayer. In their classic debate, Clay, the romantic, the champion of freedom, urged active support of revolution. The more cautious and skeptical Adams, on the other hand, warned that the United States must not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy, a phrase quoted many, many times over in the wreckage of failed U.S. interventions abroad. The best way to promote freedom, he insisted, was through the benignant sympathy of our example, by creating at home a society worthy of emulation. This discussion has reoccurred over and over and over again through the years. Echoes of it could be heard in last summer's brief debate over the possibility of military intervention in Syria. Now, the idea of a providential mission has, I think, spurred a drive to do good in the world, manifested in the work of merchants, missionaries, and educators, often the advance guard of the nation's foreign policy. It undergirded Wilson's dream of the United States as world leader and a world reformed according to American principles, a dream largely implemented after World War II. This sense of a special destiny and providential mission has also produced arrogance and justified aggressive acquisitiveness. Convinced of their superiority, righteousness, and God-given destiny, 19th century Americans were insensitive to the beliefs, habits, and behaviors of other peoples and nations. They easily rationalized pushing the Indians steadily westward to the point of extinction and taking from Mexico a huge chunk of its territory. In the 1890s, convictions of Anglo-Saxon superiority enabled proponents of overseas empire to justify imposing colonial rule on the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Hawaii, and protectorates on numerous Caribbean nations. America's new manifest destiny was to school lesser people in the benefits of civilization and prepare them for eventual self-government. The white man's burden, Kipling called it. And obviously, as Mike Hunt points out in his book, race plays a strong element in viewing the world in this particular way. From ill-fated incursions into Canada in 1775 and again the War of 1812, into Mexico during the War of 1846-48, again in 1914 and 16, into numerous Caribbean nations in the early part of the 20th century, to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, America's providential sense of mission has also justified spreading the blessings of liberty by force. Certain of the universality of their ideals, Americans confidently expected to be welcomed as liberators. The result in most cases, ironically, if not surprisingly, was to set loose powerful currents of nationalism among the people being invaded. Perhaps Lincoln, a realist and shrewd judge of character, claimed closest to the truth when he referred to Americans as God's almost chosen people. This leads to another point that, again, ironically, despite its distinctive approach to power politics, its claims to moral superiority, the United States throughout its history has behaved more like a traditional great power than Americans have perhaps realized or been prepared to admit. Between 1776 and 1815, U.S. diplomats repeatedly, skillfully exploited European rivalries to gain their independence, remarkably broad boundaries, and additional territory. From the Louisiana Purchase to the acquisition of Hawaii, they fashioned the process of infiltration and subversion into a finely tuned instrument of expansion. When the hunger for land was sated, they extended U.S. economic, political, and cultural influence throughout the world. And of course, during the Cold War, in the name of national security, the United States intervened in the affairs of other countries, overthrew popularly elected governments, Iran 1953, Guatemala 1954, and even plotted the assassination of foreign leaders such as Fidel Castro. From the founders of the 18th century to the Cold Warriors 200 years later, Americans have played the game of power politics, world politics, a game they often disparaged with sometimes ruthless skill. So much then for the myth of American innocence. The United States has at times, and in ways I think, been a force for good in the world. But this is only part of a much, much larger story. We must know the whole story to better understand who we are, and in the words of the poet, to see ourselves as others see us. Another point, popular contrast, notions to the contrary, the United States overall has been spectacularly successful in its foreign policy. Now, I know that statement's got to jar some ears. Who is this revisionist nut, you ask? What in God's name is he talking about? Liberal or conservative, we obsess about our foreign policy failures. Such notions reflect, I think, the nation's disdain for traditional diplomacy, its preference for seemingly more muscular and decisive military solutions. They also reflect a fundamental misunderstanding of the limits of diplomacy and the limits of war. By its very nature, diplomacy rarely produces the sort of clear-cut, definitive solutions we Americans prefer. It is an ongoing process that requires constant attention and adaptation and produces imperfect results. Robert Kagan has compared it to baseball, in which someone can succeed only 3 out of every 10 times and still get in the Hall of Fame. Even when wars are won decisively, they can have unfavorable unintended consequences. Classic example, World War II, where the defeat of Germany and Japan created the geopolitical conditions that gave rise to the Cold War. Such notions also, I think, reflect a short-lived view of U.S. history. To be sure, like all countries, we have suffered huge failures, sometimes with tragic consequences for us, often with tragic consequences for others. Rejection of the League of Nations, maybe. The Bay of Pigs, certainly. The 1954 intervention in Iran, celebrated by those few who knew about it in 1954 and largely forgotten, is certainly vivid in the memory of Iranians. The Vietnam War, the wars in Iraq, and probably Afghanistan, ultimately as they're viewed by historians. This said, the United States has an overall record of achievement with little precedent in history. In a little over 200 years, it conquered a continent, established dominance over the Caribbean and Pacific Ocean areas, tipped the scales towards Allied victory in 2 world wars, prevailed in a half-century Cold War, and extended its economic influence, military might, popular culture, and soft power through much of the world. By the beginning of the 21st century, it had attained that strength of a giant that Washington dreamed of in 1796. But again, ironically, and here's the catch, even as we grew more powerful, the limits to our power became more palpable, a harsh reality for which we were as a nation not prepared by temperament or history. Our remarkable historical achievements, a monotonous repetition of success, according to Woodward, produced what a British commentator once called the illusion of American omnipotence, the notion we can do anything we set our minds to. The difficult we do it tomorrow, the impossible may take a while, but we'll get there. That's kind of the way it's said. It is in our DNA, Hillary Clinton recently remarked, to believe that there are no limits on what can be achieved. Failure, therefore, causes enormous frustration. And when it occurs, again to quote Woodward, in the cosmic self-centeredness of our national worldview, we pin it on villains at home rather than acknowledge limits to our power. The fall of China to Mao Zedong's communist in 1949, an early and classic example. Many of you with me remember the question, who lost China? As though China had ever in any way been ours to lose. Many Americans still passionately believe that the United States failed in Vietnam not because of that country's unique history and idiosyncratic internal conditions, but because of our flawed strategy and our lack of will. Or even more recently, politically loaded accusations that President Obama, by showing himself to be weak, caused Russia's takeover of Crimea. The emergence of a new 21st century threat in the form of international terrorism and the stunning devastation of 9/11 underscored another hard reality, that power does not guarantee security. On the contrary, the more powerful nations become, the greater their global interest and influence, the greater their capacity to provoke anger and envy, the more targets they present to foes, the more they have to defend, creating huge costs in the form of what Paul Kennedy has called imperial overstretch. Weaker nations and non-state actors like Al-Qaeda can find ways to frustrate and, as we saw, damage hegemonic powers. Thus, America's unparalleled power, the strength of a giant, could not assure the freedom from fear that Washington had longed for in 1796. On the contrary, as Woodward observed in the 1960s, that time when the impetus of America's power first became so glaringly evident, with more power than any other nation has ever had, we enjoy less security than in the era of national weakness. The United States seems less potent at the hour of its greatest strength, theologian Reinhold Niebuhr added, than in the days of its infancy. And the unipolar moment turned out to be stunningly brief. At the turn of the century, the United States was at the pinnacle of its power, its military and economic might unchallenged. Its soft power covered the world. Less than a decade later, our military, economic, and soft power had eroded drastically. In part, I would argue this was self-inflicted. Ironically, those neoconservatives and assertive nationalists who set out after 9/11 to establish America, perpetuate America's primacy by launching an enormously expensive war in Iraq on dubious premises and waging it with singular incompetence, contributed decisively to America's fall from its turn-of-the-century preeminence. The nation's soft power no longer reigned, especially in the realm of ideals, where the handling of POWs, among many other things, exposed a huge gap between what we preached and what we practiced. The Great Recession of 2008 discredited America's economic model and raised further doubts about its ability to lead. The changing position of the United States early in this century also reflected changes in the world. While America was bogged down in Iraq and Afghanistan, emerging nations such as Brazil, Russia, India, and China seemed to surge ahead. Pundits began to speak of a post-American world, a sort of catchphrase for the early 21st century. And instead of the rise of the West, it became the rise of the rest. In terms of speed, size, and directional flow, the National Intelligence Council observed as early as 2002. The global shift now underway, roughly from west to east, is without parallel in modern history. Today's international system is extraordinarily complex, ever-changing, still somewhat murky in its essential features, and of course, as we see every day, quite volatile. To be sure, economically, the world is more interconnected and interdependent than ever before. Technology brings people together. The American-centric world order that developed from World War II appears to be fading, however. The rise of the rest has slowed. The new order is marked more by a broad dispersion of power than by the transition from one power to the other, as with Britain and the United States in the last century. What we see, in the nicely alliterative phrase of a political science, is a mosaic of multiple modernities. Don't you love that? A mosaic of multiple modernities rooted in distinct histories and political models. And in the age of interdependence and the so-called flat earth, old-fashioned geopolitics is alive and well, as manifested today as we speak in Central Europe, as manifested in the Middle East by ethnic and sectarian conflicts, and in East Asia, a burgeoning arms race and potentially quite explosive territorial disputes. An anchorless world, it has been called, an angry, unmanageable world that both craves and resents U.S. intervention. The position of the United States in this post-American world is, I think, at best ambiguous. Rumors of our decline, somewhat like those Mark Twain reported of his own death, seem to have been exaggerated. The United States still has the world's largest military and economy. It remains sort of first among equals. But its willingness and ability to shape world events have significantly eroded. Exhausted from two frustrating and costly wars, Americans steadfastly and understandably oppose military intervention. Polls reveal a sharp loss of popular confidence in our ability to shape world events, a predisposition against global engagement, and strong opposition to taking the lead in resolving world conflicts. Even pillars of the foreign policy establishment, like Richard Haass, who was head of the policy planning staff in the George Bush administration, urged a time of turning inward. Some commentators insist that the United States must continue to provide global leadership. Others claim that it would do better simply to adapt to the new emerging world order rather than try to shape it. Americans must see the world as it is, they say, rather than how they would like it to be. Now, I must confess at this point that I am much more comfortable looking back than thinking ahead. There's one of my colleagues and friends going back 50 years in my field has claimed that all of us in my field have these secret fantasies to be Secretary of State or National Security Advisor or something like that. And I always tell him that I had enough. It was all I could do to manage a history department for about 9 years. I have no such illusions or dreams or fantasies. But let me kind of try to end where I began with making a few very modest and I dare say impractical suggestions on how to deal with this new world order intelligently and thoughtfully. A first step bringing us back to where we began might be to borrow Lincoln's words, to disenthrall ourselves from deeply entrenched ideas about our country and its place in the world, to think anew and act anew. This would involve putting aside long-standing notions of ourselves as God's chosen people, the beneficiaries of a unique and providential manifest destiny. A foreign policy grounded in convictions of our providential mission and singular beneficence invariably comes across as arrogant. We must acquire, as Niebuhr suggested long ago, a sense of modesty about the virtue, wisdom, and power available to us for the resolution of history's perplexities. Unilateralism served us well during our formative years, but I think it has no place in today's world. The problems we faced, it's almost a cliche, the problems we face today are global problems, by and large, requiring global solutions. We can't solve them by ourselves or on our own terms. With military intervention off the table, we must rely on diplomacy, but in so doing, we must appreciate its inherent limits and the limits to our power. Today's world is not 1945, where, in Churchill's words, America stood at the summit. It's not the bipolar world of the early Cold War, or the more recent unipolar moment. And we must remember that even in those times, now sometimes wistfully recalled, we could not always, or even often maybe, work our will in international affairs. Diplomacy will be time-consuming and frustrating. Americans want to identify a problem, fix it, and move on. Diplomat Ryan Crocker has written. What is needed, he says, is a combination of understanding, especially of other nations and peoples, persistence, and a strategic patience to a degree that Americans traditionally have found hard to muster. The forces at work in the world today will not be easily tamed. Diplomacy will produce messy solutions, if it produces solutions at all. Foreign policy is a posh term for managing contradictions, Roger Cohen of the New York Times tells us. I offer these modest, probably chimerical proposals in full realization that, as P.D. James observed in the beginning, history has made us who we are. Change will not come easily. But I also, in the course of doing the book, discovered a strain of sort of practical idealism among the better of American diplomats who somehow managed to adhere to the nation's ideals and moral standards while working practically to attain solutions. And I think that's what needs to be tapped. We can hope it will be tapped. Thank you very much for your hearing.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm gonna say.
Oh, that's good.
I'm not
I thought
jumping.
you were running away.
I thought the window was being opened so I could escape.
Actually, George,
it.
if you look outside, the clouds have been gathering as you got into
I
your
brought
dour.
them.
More and more dour about the future.
I brought them, yeah.
Let me thank you for a very insightful lecture. I hope John Kerry, the Secretary of State, will watch the YouTube channel pretty soon and listen to your advice. Let me ask you a couple of questions before opening it up to the audience. Do you think that that old isolationism, in inverted commas, of the interwar years is coming back? Can we see a withdrawal from the world, that the United States is focusing on itself and really it's not caring about the outside world anymore?
I don't. I think the 1930s are distinct because of the extent of the separation and isolation. What's similar is what you can carry over is the 1930s mood of we made a huge mistake intervening in World War I. We don't want to repeat that mistake again. I think you can see it's not talked about because there isn't occasion to talk about it right now, but there's what I've begun to identify, if I can get it right, is a Viet-Irakistan syndrome that I think totally understandably should make us very wary of military intervention in situations like Vietnam and Iraq and the other. But in terms of trade, in terms of culture, in terms of all of these other things, we are nowhere near. I mean, what it's really like is post-Vietnam. And you saw how quickly that began to change. I mean, you by the early 1980s, in the course of the waging a new Cold War, or whatever you want to call it, after 1979, then the sort of world weariness had eroded, and commitments were being made. So I think I always love Mark Twain saying that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, and I think the 30s and today rhyme in certain ways, but I think they're also profoundly different too.
Okay, thank you. When you look at the scholarly literature, as you know better than anyone, there have always been phases of decline where historians, political scientists, and any other commentator says, well, at the moment it really is going down forever. Yeah. 10 years later, sometimes only a couple of years later, people talked about the opposite, that the US is really at the summit of its power once again. Yeah. Are we witnessing just a short phase?
When the talk of decline started to really mushroom in around 2010, I guess it was. I've got a lecture on this, but I'm sure that's
you have to come back.
I don't have it with me. Yes. What was interesting was people going back and finding in the colonial period this moaning about decline is as American as some of the other things I talked about again. It's an American Jeremiah. It's something that's so prominent in our history. I gave a graduation speech at the school I graduated from in 1957, and there was a lot of talk about decline then. And I referred them back to '58, the Sputnik, when we had reached seemingly rock bottom in 1958. Nothing was working and didn't work, and lo and behold, 6-7 years later, we are. So I think these things are very common, maybe not unique to us. They're certainly common to us. They go back to the colonial period. They're subject to change at a moment's notice, and particularly in the wake of a perceived threat. I mean, nothing would change this quicker than something to happen to present what people read as a threat, and it would change.
Thanks very much. Let's open it up to questions from you, the audience.
Yes.
There's a question there, right at the end.
I would appreciate
would you speak
views.
up?
I would appreciate your views on the role of the size of the military budget in the United States. It seems to me, I guess we've been told that it's bigger than the next
16. Well, maybe
okay.
Not, maybe less now, yeah.
And it seems to me, as long as that's the case, looking at military intervention versus diplomatic solutions, we know where we're going to end up.
You mean as long as we've got it, we're compelled to use it?
That seems to be the case.
There probably is some truth in that. I don't know. Military budget is something that I don't particularly like to look at. I think what I really am admire in many ways of Robert Gates, and I think he's a very reasonable, level-headed, commonsensical person. And he points out that when he came in as Secretary of Defense, and now the military budget didn't seem to always relate to what the needs were, that certain things have expanded and continue to expand with no rhyme or reason other than that the company that produces these things may be in some congressperson's district. And of course the military rivalries among the military itself do a lot to shape the military budget. My biggest complaint about the military budget would not be the size of it as much as whether it really is, suits the needs and concerns that we have at this particular time. I suppose certainly, I think I'll go back to something I know, if you'll forgive me for that. Certainly in the 60s, I think without question, in the mid-60s, after the never again syndrome from Korea had passed, there was a tendency for the military to want to try some of these things in Vietnam, and that maybe has some impact on their recommendations, but I don't think the fact that and of course, if we hadn't had it, we couldn't do it. I mean, that's what you're getting down to, and I think there's probably some truth in that.
Thank you. But when we look towards Russia and Ukraine, NATO could be even stronger than it is. The US could be even stronger. Could we really use it?
Yeah, yeah. No, that was the point I was trying to make throughout here. That we learn and relearn and relearn and relearn, never adequately the limits of lesson or the idea of the limits of power.
But if I could just jump in, I mean, it seems to me that the point you made, or you're suggesting, at least to me, is that as historians we know that these military budgets never, military strategies never fit the particular scenario, the particular challenges that we're ultimately confronted with. Yeah. And therefore, I mean, so as historians, we don't know, what to say really. That's very practical. Yeah. And I guess, second of all, you as historians, we'd say, well, we want a really big budget, so we'll have lots and lots of things we can pick and choose.
So we can do it all.
So we can do it all.
Yeah,
or we don't have anything.
Of course, again, what happened in Vietnam was they sent to Vietnam an army that was set up to fight the Soviets in Central Europe, and that there was some problem with that. And then afterwards, there was a never no Vietnam again, so they completely ignored counterinsurgency. Then there's this brief flirtation with counterinsurgency, so that maybe doesn't look so hot either. When you figure it's 20 years, 25 years, 30 years, whatever, and you still may not do it. Yeah.
So then you're really left then with the armed services or the Defense Department coming up with contingency with enemies, identifying enemies that will then fit the budgets they want, which is not exactly what
the United States and Japan, the United States at the turn of the century is a classic case of that. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, please. Gerd Weinberg.
Well, for that, you might refer to that marvelous cartoon that appeared during the invasion of Iraq. There is this bunch of American soldiers coming from Central Europe in their uniforms, and a reporter is asking in the middle of the desert why they are wearing that the combat uniform of Central Europe. And the sergeant responds to the correspondent, why? It's to make, in the middle of the desert, it's to make us invisible among this lush vegetation.
That's great. Great.
Any more questions?
Other questions?
George,
Michael,
your recommendation. I mean, I'm kind of chewing on your recommendations here.
Yeah.
But the other one you made that I'm just kind of caught my fancy, this idea of a disenthralled America.
Yeah.
But what does a disenthralled America believe in? I mean, what is there a kind of a national? I mean, let's assume we can use the term nationalism to describe what we what holds us together. Yeah. But is being disenthralled, does that cut so deeply into who we are that you don't really have anything left, and we're then become
wanderers,
or we set off?
No, that's good. That's an excellent point.
Or it really presumes that if you're going to be disenthralled, that you're going to presume you're going to be able to construct, or we're inviting someone to construct something that does enthrall us, as opposed to changing the world or policing the world or transforming the world.
And how much better did we feel after the Carter malaise when Reagan came in and told us
we're supporting in America.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
In the conflict between Obama and Putin, do you feel Obama's image of weakness is encouraging Russia?
I don't know. There are probably people in here who know a lot more about Putin and Russia than I do. Instinctively, I am repelled by that sort of argument. In fact, my solution for the problem when it first started was to put John McCain and Lindsey Graham in uniforms and give them an airplane and some ordnance and tell them to go get it. Be tough. It may be one factor, but Putin being a rational man and knowing how close that is to him and how far it is away from us would reach the same conclusion anyway, no matter what, right? I mean, it's just, and he must have people who tell him about the mood of the country, but even if this country were in an aggressive mood right now, I can't conceive that we would do anything to change that situation, or should do anything to change that situation. So I was reading a really nice book on the Mexican War, and I saw a statement either by the Democratic press in the 1840s or somebody that was saying exactly the same thing about, us and the Mexicans as McCain and Lindsey Graham were saying. And I said, boy, that one, I guess that's human nature, that we can't appear weak or that this, that, and that. I would say it might be one of many, many, many factors that are going into this. But in terms of Crimea, the craziness of that situation, I mean, that was really an idiosyncratic situation. And the complexity of the Ukraine situation. Oh my God, what a mess. What a mess.
What could Obama do? What would make him look stronger?
Sanctions never make you look strong because they never work once, and or almost never. They take some very long time if they're going to work. And protests look strong once, but when you do it over and over and over again, so I don't have an answer to that except McCain and Lindsey Graham. That's my that's my answer.
Yes, please.
First of all, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for letting this be open to the general public. That is
absolutely
wonderfully appreciated. In Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization, he sort of makes the point that there's a migration that happens over time between that country that has the hegemony, the power. And I think at the end of the book sort of argues that maybe we have seen the apex of ours. Does that resonate with you?
No, I don't. I mean, if you're talking about the sort of position we had in 1945 and 2000, but those positions, what were they the result of? They're a result of history, of World War II and of the end of the Cold War. I don't see things as being that predictable. I think as historians we come to see, we think in terms of the unpredictability. I would think that this country has the potential still to be a great country, as maybe John Quincy Adams saw it, and others. But
well, if that is the case, then how does one manifest that?
Good. That's an even better question. A functioning economy with justice for all its people. How about things like that? I mean, I think that rather than a country with a great military that goes around trying to solve everybody else's problems, I think built on the principles that were stated in the founding.
Yes, please.
Yeah. I wonder if you can think out loud for a moment about Eisenhower and
sure.
sort of reassessment and a changed attitude maybe about his time and his
and by that you mean looking at him more positively, or?
Well, looking at him differently, I might say. I'm not sure it would always be positive.
Are you referring to the fact that Eisenhower didn't start any wars, or
Yes.
is that what you want?
Well, yeah, okay. I mean, that's true, and he wisely avoided sending troops to Vietnam in 1954. But why did he wisely avoid it? Because the British said no, and the French wouldn't do it on our terms, and I'm not convinced that. There's a lot of evidence that he was willing to send them. I think, when I was in graduate school, I started graduate school when Ike left office. So, and of course, Ike was the joke among intellectuals and academics and that sort of thing. Read Western novels, played golf, sat in the White House and didn't do anything. Well, we've come a long way from that, both in terms of foreign policy and domestic policy. He was a good politician. He was supposed to be functional, almost illiterate, but he wrote beautiful letters. And he's the last president who probably wrote letters, I would say, right? Kennedy, to my knowledge, did not write. Wrote wonderful letters to his own army buddies, which he discusses, frankly, affairs of state and the difficulty he faces. So I'll say, yeah, we've come a long way from that. I think we're getting a balanced, but as our colleague Bob McMahon has pointed out, he got through the time without problems in the third world, but he created an awful lot of problems that other people had to pick up the pieces from. He made the early commitments in Vietnam when everybody was saying, you know, the odds of success there are very, very low. Went ahead anyway. I think John Foster Dulles even said 10 to 1 against success, something like that. That won't get me far at our local racetrack. So against that sort of advice, he went ahead anyway. And they did because they had had that great success in Iran, Guatemala. They came to believe for a brief moment there that the world was kind of their oyster. The Iran thing, short term, yeah, looked great. Long term, it looks like a disaster because this was a duly elected government, a secular government. And the Cuban thing, So I think historians, or at least the people who work in my field, have a balanced sort of view. Somebody wrote a book this year that was published and got a lot of attention. I can't think of whether it must have been was it a journalist or
Evans, yeah, someone like called Evans.
Yeah. And I didn't read the book, but some of the reviews I thought were trying, as Doris Kearns Goodwin does repeatedly, to take the history and fit it perfectly into our times and get it to say everything she wants to say. What was Lincoln's team of rivals? Yeah, I mean, a lot of historians said, you know, the whole idea is just wrong. Because it didn't work that smoothly. And there were all kinds of problems. So, yeah. But you have to, when I got into the Eisenhower papers and saw these letters and saw this little diary and all this stuff, I said, thank you, Ike. You're a good guy. You've done us a great service.
Thanks very much. Can we briefly talk about a relationship which is, apart from Russia, on everyone's mind, that is the American-Chinese relationship?
Yeah.
How do you view that? I know. I want to use the opportunity of drawing Michael into the discussion. Maybe we'll start with you and then we'll go to
I'll
Michael.
be very brief so Michael can say something intelligent. Well, I run into that because in recent years, as we were talking about in the class, there's been this remarkable rapprochement between the United States and its enemy of many years, Vietnam, which has a lot to do with China. I'm gonna hedge it simply by saying that the whole situation in East Asia, while we're focused now on Central Europe, the situation in East Asia looks absolutely scary when you consider the arms buildups in a lot of different nations, when you consider Chinese aspirations and going about these aspirations in, I think, a rather traditional manner, right? I mean, in terms of the Middle Kingdom and this sort of thing, and Japanese resistance and the volatility of the Koreas. It's something that you don't want to, if you want to enjoy life, you don't sit around thinking, particularly because we are, talk about engaged. The Korean War is not over. We're still there. And we're beginning to assume some commitments with other nations, including Vietnam. I don't think there are any commitments with Vietnam, and the island, all these disputes over islands. And it's so easy in situations like this to have miscalculations. And given the volatility of that region, the miscalculations.
In Washington think tanks, what they're trying to do, as far as I can see, is to look at the Chinese-American relationship and say that is a new way, a new model for superpower, great power relations. So you don't think there's any validity in that?
Yeah.
Another question.
Yeah.
On this Budapest memorandum from 1994, does the follow-on to that make that look like?
I'm sorry, I missed.
That Budapest memorandum, the guarantee U.S., UK, and Russia gave to Ukraine to maintain its territorial integrity and sovereignty, which is more or less been trashed.
How do we come from China to Budapest? I don't know.
I've got
Can we just put that up? Let's finish the discussion on China. Michael, do you want to come in and predict what is happening to the American Chinese?
I don't like to predict. I'm not into predictions. But I think
Speculate.
I would agree with George. I mean, one of the themes that you've been drawing, I think, is this sense of the world as divided up into areas of particular concern to particular powers. And that's, so you've got China, and you've got Japan, and you've got Russia, and you've got Brazil, which actually has been, at least until very recently, looking pretty good as a leader within its region. And I think the notion that somehow this world is fragmenting into areas of great power dominance, which is a kind of realpolitik.
19th century.
19th century, or even, I'm not even sure it belongs particularly to the 19th century. Just the great powers, are most concerned with what abuts them. So, but I think it's a very hard idea for Americans then, for the the reasons you laid out. It's very hard for us to assimilate the idea for, this idea of a multipolar, genuinely multipolar world, which has its territorial implications as well as economic and all the rest. Assimilate that to some of our, kind of heartfelt, our enthralled, ideas. So I think that for us that's one of the enduring problems with China. And so as you were suggesting, Klaus, you come up with all these new notions that will somehow square the circle. We can still have American dominance in the region, or at least a major role in the region. And this will somehow allow China at the same time to be happy, with its role. And I don't think
You're
that
skeptical.
really pans. That's a sort of an illusion. I think that there is a kind of a stark choice: either we're shaping the world, or we're giving room to other countries to shape the world within their.
But that essentially would mean we will see a new Cold War, maybe not with Russia, but with China.
But the trouble is, it's a multifaceted Cold War because it's not just two powers, or a power and a half.
Nor is ideology quite what it would have been before.
Exactly.
Which added a huge dimension to it.
I think you're having two powers and each having a strong ideological program. But that's simply not the. I mean, as you say, the Chinese are, I think, are in a way fairly traditional in their view of their place in the world. This is not a highly ideological.
And traditional is expansive.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you. There was I think I saw that. Okay, you come in again.
Well, I'm sorry.
You asked about the Budapest Memorandum of 1994.
Does that make that's a diplomatic coup in a way, and yet it now looks like it's totally passé.
I'm not sure.
Was the guarantee the US, the UK gave to observe Ukrainian independence?
Do we actually have the text of that?
We do have a text, not right now, but there is a text. It is available.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. That's another question.
Allow me to bring up my current favorite topic these days, and that's the concept of and the role of the spheres of influence in today's world.
Yeah.
I appreciate you.
It's not. You don't hear that term used much, do you? That's
I've
interesting.
been using it lately.
Well, yeah. Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
But it seems like it's applicable in today's world, and I'd like your views on it in Americans.
So what is
American history?
What? Oh, okay. Well, traditionally we did not like spheres of influence and denied that we had our own, which of course we very much had. I mean, that's sort of the traditional Wilsonian. Yeah, Wilsonian. During the Cold War, I don't think, well, I mean, during the Cold War, except for Cuba, spheres of influence were sort of implicitly recognized because, for example, there was no serious thought given to intervening in Hungary in 1956 or in Czechoslovakia in '68. So tacitly we acknowledge the Soviet sphere of influence. I think after Cuba, for the most part, I mean, they willing to sort of concede this one, although there was messing around in Nicaragua, but you know, that was, I think, blown out of proportion. But it's something, I haven't seen the word written in the press or anything and about contemporary problems in a long time. And
well, these days people say soft power, I guess.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Let me ask you a final question before we perhaps go home for today. You are an expert on the Vietnam War, of course, and despite all the cruelty committed, all the problems caused, and that brutal war, within a few years the United States really had recovered its image from the Vietnam War. Even its economic performance picked up again. Can we expect something similar happen after now the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War? And also let's think of the cultural soft power of the United States. Yeah. China and Russia and Brazil still don't rival globally that cultural soft power. So are we a little bit perhaps too pessimistic what the United States well, future in the world is concerned?
Yeah, I think for one thing, I don't think the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, because the way they fought and without draftees and without an anti-war movement or anything, had anywhere like the impact they had that Vietnam had. I mean, that's a whole different thing. As we talked about in the class, it was kind of unique to that generation when everything was up for grabs and all the old verities were greeted skeptically and that sort of thing. I mean, what has done damage this time is the recession. I mean, that seems to me has been where the real impact has been rather than the wars. I mean, and the impact on individuals. Oh, the incredible impact on individuals who fought and did 4 or 5 tours or one tour. And some of the stuff, the more stuff you read, the more it just makes you cry. It's just awful. But so the real impact of the wars was on the military and the families and those who fought it. The rest of us really weren't. The recession hit all of us, and that's what I think, and that's probably where the metaphor of decline sort of, yeah, we didn't work our way in Iraq and Afghanistan, but it's that little, I don't want to use one shining moment because that's March Madness and that's something different, but it was that one little moment in the 90s and afterwards when, you know, we soft power, money, military, everything, we were there. But I think it's the recession which has really been what stamped this.
Also for the country's global image?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Because what was the whole thing about globalization? It was the American economic model, right? Was supposed to be the secret to globalization and global economic advancement. And the recession and the way it happened, and for those who in the know about how it happened with the shenanigans on Wall Street and that sort of thing, did a huge damage to the image.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you all for your good questions and your patience.
Professor George Herring, thanks for coming to us today and for enlightening us. Further enlightenment, further insights in the fall lecture series. Please come back. Thank you for coming. And please sign up on our mailing list if you haven't done so already. Thank you.